Welcome back to Catalyst University. My name is Kevin Tokoph, and in this video, we're going to complete our three-part series over best practices for advanced core strengthening. In the previous two videos, we talked about core strengthening in the sagittal plane, in the coronal plane, and now we're going to finish up with strengthening in the transverse plane. But before we delve into the specific exercises for this, let's review a few best practices and concepts for how to choose the best exercises for a given muscle, or in this case, the core. And the first of these principles is this: you cannot isolate any of the core muscles. You cannot isolate the rectus abdominis, you cannot isolate the parts of the obliques, you cannot isolate the deep core muscles, aka the transversus abdominis. So I know you have to take EMG studies with a grain of salt, but what we found is that any given core muscle-based movement, like a sit-up, a crunch, a side bend, rotation, etc., against resistance, gets all four of the core muscles going. All four core muscles activate together. You cannot isolate any of them. There usually, however, are one or two muscles that predominate. But it's not always intuitive which of those muscles predominate. For example, we would expect, based on the actions of the muscles, that if we do a sagittal plane motion, like a sit-up type of movement, that the rectus abdominis would predominate. And in some of them, yes, it does. But in others, like the hanging knee up, which is certainly occurring in the sagittal plane, the rectus abdominis does not predominate. It certainly activates, but it's actually the oblique muscles that predominate, and this is based off of EMG studies that I've talked about in other videos. So the bottom line is, you can't isolate any of these muscles, and there's usually one or two that predominate, but it's not always intuitive. And so we can't just say, oh, we're doing a sit-up type of movement, so this is getting rectus abdominis. Can't say that. So what we usually talk about are strengthening the various planes of motion, okay? And as long as you're hitting all of the planes of motion, you are getting adequate strengthening and activation and hypertrophy of all the various core muscles. Okay, so that's principle number one. The second principle is this, and I cover this in a lot more detail in other videos. When we talk about core stability exercises, core stability being isometric exercises of the core, like your Palloff press, any plank variation, farmer, suitcase carries, any of these isometric exercises, these core stability exercises, these for strength and hypertrophy are inferior to any of these exercises we're going to be talking about that takes the lumbar spine through a full range of motion against resistance, okay? What we know from pretty much any study is that isometric contractions are inferior to concentric and eccentric, which typically occur together. They're inferior for building pretty much any measurable parameter in skeletal muscle, whether it be size, strength, power, endurance, etc. If we want to improve those things, we need to be moving that part of the body through a full range of motion against resistance. And that's what these exercises we're going to be talking about here do. The third is a series of things, okay? And some of them we've already hit on a little bit. What constitutes a good exercise that we can select, okay? So number three, part A, if you were keeping track like that, is we want the exercise to move that area of the body, those joints, through a full range of motion, okay? Obviously, core stability exercises don't use any range of motion of the lumbar spine, so they automatically fail in this first test, okay? Full range of motion. Part B is we want to get a stretch on the target muscle at some point in the movement, okay? That means when we're moving through the range of motion, we want that muscle to be stretched as much as possible, okay? Number three, we want that exercise to be easy to progressively overload. Not all exercises are easy to progressively overload. A sit-up or a crunch, kind of difficult to progressively overload, especially through a full range of motion. And number four, we want the point of maximum stretch on the muscle, if possible, to also coincide with the position of peak tension on the muscle during that exercise. Okay, and we'll actually see a few of them in this video that actually satisfy all four of those. Okay, so if you can satisfy all four of these principles right here, it's probably going to be a really good exercise for strengthening and getting hypertrophy out of that muscle. Okay? And without further ado, let's get right into those exercises. Now, when we're strengthening lumbar rotation, obviously we want the rotation to be receiving the vast majority of the resistance on the movement to strengthen rotation, right? Which seems kind of trivial, but if you look at some of these exercises like this one that are posted to social media, this is a fantastic exercise. It's certainly better than a core stability exercise, but realistically, the vast majority of the stimulus is on lumbar flexion. So it's training the sagittal plane a lot more. Yes, there's some rotation thrown in there, but that's only a smaller percentage of the load that's given to the movement. So if we're looking for strengthening lumbar rotation, we're better off saving the GHD sit-ups, which are great, by the way, for sagittal strengthening, and then doing something entirely separate and different for training rotation. And therein lies another problem with training rotation, is that pretty much any movement you can possibly think of to strengthen this is going to in some way involve the arms. And so arms can become a limiting factor. So what I'm going to do is take those 4 check boxes that we talked about earlier in the video and make a slight amend to them. So yes, we want a full range of motion. Yes, we want a stretch of the target muscle. We want theoretically that stretch to correspond to the point of maximum tension on the muscle. We want easy progressive overload, and number 5, which is more applicable here for the transverse plane, we want the target muscle to be the limiting factor in the movement. We don't want other secondary or stabilizer muscles, let's say, to be the limiting factor. It's kind of like if, let's say, you were wanting to do pull-ups to strengthen the lats. And you could also do lat pull-downs, but let's say that maybe due to body weight, your limiting factor on pull-ups was your grip strength, but it wasn't a limiting factor on lat pull-downs. Well, then pull-ups are no longer a great exercise, because if grip strength becomes limiting, well, then it's not as good. We want the lats to be more limiting for the exercise, if that makes sense. So we don't want the arms in general to be limiting for lumbar rotation. So that's an important consideration to keep in mind, and it's really why this first exercise is the honorable mention. What we've got here are banded or cable, if you're at a gym, lumbar rotations. So what you can see here in the video clip is I'm sidestepping out, first of all, just to get to the point where my arms are essentially pulled passively across my body. And then I'm going to keep the arms outstretched and just perform lumbar rotation with control. Control the eccentric, come out as far as I can. If I'm not able to go all the way to the other side, that's okay, because the stretch position is the most important part, okay? It is fairly easy to progressively overload this lift up to a point. And the point is usually where your arm strength becomes the limiting factor. And when your arm strength becomes the limiting factor, you can't really overload it beyond that without compromising form. And so, yes, this is a good exercise for a lot of people, and it's definitely a great place to start. But if you really want to get more bang for your buck, for rotational core strengthening, you're better off with these other 2 exercises that we're about to talk about, because in my experience, they tend to be a lot less limited by upper extremity strength than just straight rotations with a straight arm, or straight arms, I should say. You can be the judge of that. Maybe you find the results a little bit different than I do, but for me personally, just straight lumbar rotations with a band or cable, arm strength becomes the limiting factor, especially if I'm using a cable machine. Okay, at some point I can't load it anymore because my arms aren't strong enough. Okay, so that leads us to the first of these exercises, which is the landmine rotations. You do need some things to be able to set this up. You need something to anchor the barbell down. You could just put one end of the barbell down in a corner of a wall, but obviously you have to have a free corner to do that. But in any case, as long as you have a landmine set up like this, what you're going to do is just basically hold the barbell and let yourself rotate down all the way to one side. Feel the stretch in these core muscles on that side, And then when you come back up, it's not driving with the arms, it's driving up with those core muscles. Don't drive with the arms, drive with the core. And yes, the arm muscles will have to work, but drive with the core. And you just go back and forth, back and forth. Now, a few other things on landmine rotations. You want to keep your core tight on this, keeping your core engaged. However, don't think of this as a stiff body movement, okay? You want to allow your hips to move. And also, if let's say I'm coming down to my right, I'm allowing myself to pivot up onto the balls of my contralateral foot, the left foot. Conversely, if I'm coming down to my left, I'm pivoting up onto the balls of my contralateral, in this case, right foot. So the hips, the feet, they do move a little bit. And that's going to allow you to get into more range as you're going down to the various sides, okay? The other thing with this is, again, I kind of like to stick in the 6 to 10 rep range per side. So if I'm getting through those repetitions and I'm not really gassed, like it's not becoming a significant challenge, you want to add more weight. Like doing these right here, I think I did 8 repetitions per side. I didn't feel like this was too much of a challenge on the core, and certainly my arms were not gassed out. So I'm going to load even more weight on this. If we're trying to go for strength, we want to load as much weight as we can without compromising form. And again with this, because you are using the arms, you want to make sure that your arms are good and warmed up. So I might recommend that before you do anything like this, that you might do a couple warm-up exercises, maybe involving some rows, maybe some deep push-ups to get the serratus anterior going, all that good stuff, okay? But landmine rotations, absolutely phenomenal for training rotation. And there is a little bit of side bending involved in that, but mainly rotation. Now, the second exercise. This is one that I don't see given too much, but if you've never tried it, you really should. It's called a rotational sled drag, and you'll see it right here. So the rotational sled drag, think of yourself as facing forward, and that's the 0 degree mark. And then out to one side is, let's say, negative 90 degrees. Out to the other side is positive 90 degrees. And your job is to essentially turn the sled into a windshield wiper and go from negative 90 to 90 and back to negative 90. And as long as you keep your body and your feet more or less pointed in that 0 degree direction, this will absolutely shred up your core. Now, I'm going to critique my own work here on this clip here. The sled that I have at home is a little bit lower, so I kind of have to lean a little forward. You can see there. The sled that we have at my clinic is a lot taller, at least the handles are taller, so I can be upright with it. And remember, if we're going for hypertrophy of these muscles, well, we want to have as much stretch on the muscle as possible. So if I'm down, kind of hunched forward like I am in this video, I'm not going to get as much stretch. So it would be much better if I was able to have a sled where I'm able to stand upright and do it like this, because then I'm going to have more stretch at any given moment in that range of motion, okay? But rotational sled drags, if you've never tried this exercise, oh man, definitely try it. And not only that, it will get your heart rate up quite a bit. Make sure you breathe on this exercise. Between repetitions, so if I'm over here, inhale, exhale forcefully as you rotate all the way to the other side. Definitely give these 2 exercises a try, but understand that just straight lumbar rotations with a band or cable, it's not a bad exercise. But when you start to become limited by your arm strength, okay, maybe get your arms stronger. But again, try one of these other 2 exercises, which in my experience are not quite as limited by upper extremity strength as the straight rotations. All right, so hopefully this video gave you a good understanding about best practices for strengthening lumbar rotation. And now by this point, if you watched all 3 videos, you've got a good grasp of the sagittal plane, the coronal plane, and now the transverse plane. Please make sure to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and please hit that notification button for notifications for all videos in the future. Thank you so much.